strive for better, protecting our liberty.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Your Right to Know, brought to you by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. Coming to you from Workers Credit Union Studios at FATV. My name is Andrew Couture. I will be your co-host this evening, and with me as always is Mary Lotze. And this is going to be a two-part, this is the second part of a two-part series. Our last month's episode was about voter fraud. This month is going to be about ranked choice voting, or otherwise known as RCV. And the show's title is Ranked Choice Voting, Is This a Better and More Representative Way to Vote? And with us today is Dr. Frederick Van Bennekom. Doctor, how are you today?
I'm fine.
And can you just introduce yourself to our guests and give us a brief bio for our viewers?
Sure, just professionally. I live in Bolton, Mass, as you guys know. I worked for Digital Equipment Corporation as a business analyst many moons ago when the company still existed. Then I went back to school for my doctorate in operations management at Boston University. And as a result of getting my doctorate, I've been teaching as an adjunct professor, teaching operations management in a lot of the Boston area business schools. But my primary professional work is as a surveyor. So I'm a professional surveyor and survey trainer. I've been running training classes teaching people how to run surveys. And just as a lead-in, I tell people, and in my own surveys, and I teach in my classes, that I don't use ranked choice questions when I'm trying to measure importance. So that kind of plays into the whole area of why I'm interested in this.
Now, as I stated before, last month we discussed voter fraud and voter suppression with Dr. Strand as a way to change the election outcome. This month we're exploring the term ranked choice voting, or RCV. This is not considered voter fraud or suppression, but a new way of voting and counting cast ballots to determine the winner. We're going to be seeing this in the future, as it appears that ranked choice voting will be a ballot initiative in this November election. So, Dr. Frederick, please define ranked choice voting, and how did you become interested in this type of voting?
Okay, well, I got intrigued by it because, as I just said, I never use these ranked choice questions or forced rank questions in surveys, where basically what you're trying to do is identify importance of different factors towards, say, a purchase decision. You know, if you're buying a new computer, a new car, what are the 5 most important things, and ask people to put them in order. And I don't like to use them because they are prone to respondent annoyance and respondent error, to use those terms. And it basically, the respondent annoyance is that people look and say, what am I supposed to do? And they get so annoyed they don't answer the question. And respondent error is they think they know what they're supposed to do, but they don't do it right. Mm-hmm. And if you ever do one of these questions on paper, you're probably going to have to throw the question out because people aren't going to fill them out correctly. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, okay, so we're going to elect people to our offices using this type of question. So I got kind of intrigued, and I went to, I ran a search and found the ranked choice voter website, the nationwide one, and I looked at it and I was like, okay, I get it. But then I was trying to figure out who these people were. And I was kind of scratched my head on this because they had, on any website you go to About Us and you find out who they are. Well, here they had 4 people on a project team, but that was it, and clearly they weren't running it. So the only other identification was a phone number. They had no physical street address, which is very odd for websites. You always are supposed to have a street address. So I ran a search on the phone number, and I wound up at fairvote.org, which is a left-wing organization that's trying to change the way elections are run to better enable liberals to get elected. I'm not saying it's nefarious, but they're always trying to push those things that can help Democrats and liberals to get elected. So I thought to myself, what do they know that I don't know? What are they seeing in ranked choice voting procedure that can help them with their electoral goals? And so that got me intrigued by going through this. Now, you asked me to define it. Okay, so let me do that an example in the context of an example. So I'm hoping we're going to bring up here the first slide. And I'm going to do this from an actual example. The state of Maine uses ranked choice voting. And in the Maine 2nd Congressional District in 2018, an election was decided as a result of ranked choice voting. So if we look at the slide, what we're going to see is the ballot that people looked at in the 2nd Maine Congressional. Could you bring it up again for a moment? Look at it. And there were 4 candidates. And so there are 4 candidates and a write-in. There was a Democrat, Jared Golden, and Bruce Poliquin was a Republican, and there were 2 independents. And if you look at that, you'll see we wind up with a 5-by-5 grid. And we're asking people to rank choice their 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, conceivably if there's a write-in. So that's with 4. So imagine if we had 7 candidates. Now we're going to have a 7-by-7 grid. It's going to get a lot more complicated. And we'll probably talk about this later, but it's my belief that ranked choice voting is going to lead to a proliferation of third-party candidates, fringe candidates. So the ballots could get very complicated. So if we go to the next slide, I'm actually going to show you the results as posted on the State of Maine website, the election website. And those are the vote totals for the 4 candidates. And if you look at the percentages on the right, you'll see that Bruce Poliquin, the incumbent Republican, quote unquote won. He got the most votes.
It looks like 46.37.
46 plus, and Jared Golden, the Democrat, got 45.6 roughly. So it was close. It was like a 1-point difference. But Poliquin did not get to 50%.
Which is the key, because that was going to be one of my questions, is that...
Yes. Ranked choice voting, the argument behind it is we want the person to be elected by a majority, which means greater than 50%. So the procedure is, okay, nobody got to 50, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the ballots for the candidates that got eliminated, that got the lowest votes. And technically you start with the person that got the lowest votes. In this case, the 2 candidates that got the lowest votes, they're going to kick them out both together because the person who got the least number couldn't have put anybody over 50%. So if we bring up the next slide, you'll see here, and this is hard to follow, I apologize, but that is part of the lesson here. The fact that it's so complicated. You'll notice in the red circles I have the 2 candidates' votes that were being eliminated. So now we're saying there were 23,427 ballots for the 2 candidates that are getting booted out, Bond and Hoare, and we're going to look at those ballots for the second choice that people made. And if we now look to the right, we see that Jared Golden, the Democrat, got 10,422, 69% of the ballots that were legitimate. Of the 23,427 ballots examined, only 15,000 plus were legitimate ballots. So another 8,000 were thrown out, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So of the 15,000 plus that were examined, Golden got 10,000 of them, 69%, and as a result, we can see on the right that Jared Golden's percentage now topped 50%. Barely. But it topped 50. So again, it was a really close vote even with that, but he was pushed over the top by winning more than 2/3 of the second choice votes for the 2 candidates that were eliminated. Got that?
Well, you know,
my head is spinning.
it is very confusing,
Yes.
but I'm thinking of the caucus that we just witnessed.
I was gonna
Well,
say,
not so much. Well, I think of the Iowa caucus, because that looks like, you know, a maze there. That looks like a bad math experiment. But I was thinking, what was the one we just had recently that right away Bernie Sanders achieved over the 50%? And Nevada. And therefore, that ended it. He achieved this magic number. It's a little...
They're assigning delegates, so it's a little bit different.
But that 50%, which is considered the majority, even if it's only 5 votes over 50% of the total, that seems to trigger the not having to go to this second level math project.
It would, yes. If in the first round a candidate gets over 50, we're done. It's just like a regular election. It's when a candidate doesn't get to 50. And so now we're going to examine the second place votes of the candidates who got the fewest votes. But, you know, I said that was confusing, and this is part of my point. That is really confusing. I had to really study the spreadsheet, which the state of Maine makes available. I studied it for an hour trying to figure out the logic of it. Now, I would argue that if we as voters don't understand how election winners are determined, how much faith are we going to have? That to me is a real negative, because it is so opaque. You'd say, well, somebody told me this person won. Well, I don't know. I can't figure it out, but I got to trust them.
You know what it reminds me a little of? And when you talk about voter confusion, how easy it is to confuse people. I remember after the George W. Bush and Al Gore presidential,
Florida.
And there were people down in Florida that were telling people, you didn't vote properly.
Correct.
And people believed it, and they were running around like the sky is falling because someone told them that maybe they didn't vote properly and they wanted a do-over.
And a point I'll make as a surveyor, I tell people there's no such thing as a perfect survey. There's no such thing as a perfect survey administration. There's always error. We're trying to minimize the error, but there's always going to be error. An election is a survey.
Is a survey.
And the ballot is a questionnaire. So there's always going to be some amount of error. So I don't know if we can bring up the next slide. Remember I was talking that there were 25,000 ballots, roughly 23,000 brought into the second round, and only 15,000 had legitimate ballots. Well, here we see that in the round two, it's showing it adds to 23,000, but it doesn't have the 15,000 above it. Roughly one-third, more than one-third, 35% of the ballots that were examined for their second choice vote were disqualified. Mostly because people didn't choose anybody, but a number of people chose the same person they did the first time, or other mistakes. But when you hear the ranked choice voting people, and my issue with these folks is they tell you that everything is beautiful, this is a perfect system. It's not. And they're not telling you the downsides. And they'll tell you that it's fair and simple and easy. Well, if it's so simple and easy to do, how come 1/3 of the people in the Maine 2nd Congressional District did it wrong?
Did it wrong. I mean, I work the polls in our city of Fitchburg, and people, I can't tell you in an election how many times people will spoil a ballot. We have to spoil a ballot because people get confused. It will say, vote for 3 of 5 candidates. And they know, but they just kind of, forget where they are, and they're voting for more than 3. They'll vote for, and fortunately the machines pick it up, overvote, not a problem. They get a new ballot, we spoil it. But it's very easy. You get confused. You're nervous when you go vote. Many people get nervous. They're afraid of making the wrong decision. And we
know exactly who I'm voting
yeah.
for.
Well, we tell them. I mean, I've been telling the people as I've worked early voting week, there's no wrong answers. But people get nervous.
So imagine being confronted with this massive ballot with a 5x5 grid, and going, what am I supposed to do?
What am I supposed to do?
So, on the ballot initiative, and I've read the ballot initiative, Secretary Galvin is going to have to go through a significant voter education, but I also think we're going to see education and perhaps some miseducation done by the political parties.
Sure.
Because this is a system that can, I'm going to say gamed, that may be a too loaded a word, but one of the key things you're going to do in a system like this where there are 4 or 5 candidates is you want to be darn sure that your voters know how to cast the ballot.
Well, I mean, my suspicions are raised with ranked choice voting. I mean, we know it's going to be a ballot question in Massachusetts on November 20, but it's supported by Secretary of State Galvin, Jim McGovern, Seth Moulton, Lori Trahan, among others. So why isn't this being supported by? Why is this being supported by the progressive left versus conservatives or Republicans? What do the Dems know that we on the right don't know about ranked choice voting?
And you know, initially I said, when I went and did my initial research and I went, oh, look at this, fair votes behind this, I was suspicious and I said, what did they figure out that I don't see? Here's my guess, and it is a guess. We typically in elections see the third party candidates being from the left. At the national level, you have the Green Party, and they've been there for a long time. You know, you go to Florida,
Yeah.
that was part and parcel
Yeah.
of the Florida issue. So there is a kind of an established third party on the left, and there really isn't that on the right. We have the Libertarian
I was
Party,
going to say the Libertarian Party,
but they're a smaller percentage, and I would argue, as somebody with strong libertarian views, I'd argue it's kind of between the Republican and Democrat. It's not to
Yeah,
the right of
right.
the Republicans.
Yeah.
It's much more center because the positions don't fit cleanly in either one.
Right.
So I think what's happened, and we can go to the state of Maine as an example, Governor LePage won the governorship in his 2 elections with less than a majority. He got 42% in the first one, I believe, and I think 48% in his re-election. And why? Because there were 2 liberal candidates. There was the Democrat, obviously, and there was a third-party candidate who was quite popular, and they split the vote. And this was a big issue when LePage went up for re-election, because people were saying, don't vote for, I forget who it was, don't vote for him, we're going to, you'll re-elect LePage. So that's part of the reason why I believe Maine was there was a lot of push to get RCV in Maine, because they didn't want that happening again with a third-party candidate, quote, spoiling the election. So I think the reason it's being pushed from the left is that they tend to have the third-party candidate who is more likely to throw the election, quote unquote, to the Republican.
Well, just thinking about the last third-party candidate that really sticks out in my mind would be Ross Perot.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And
You know, because
you could say Ross Perot
it was because of Ross Perot
that we ended up with Bill Clinton.
that we ended up with Bill Clinton.
Yes.
If not, we would have had
HW.
a second term of the first
H.W. Bush, yes.
Most likely. We don't know, we never know, but
Right.
that is the conventional wisdom.
Right. And he probably, actually, from a third-party candidate perspective, probably took the largest percentage of votes ever. Did he?
Yes, he is in recent times.
Yeah.
George Wallace drew a lot.
Oh,
he actually won electoral votes.
Okay.
Believe it or not, because he won some southern states. That's the other major third party
Major third party, yeah.
that we've seen.
Same little oxymoron there.
Us that were around then. So I think the reason why the left is pushing is because they don't want to lose elections because of third parties. And what RCV does, it says, okay, you're a Green Party voter, go and vote for your Green Party candidate as number 1, but be sure to vote for the Democrat as number 2. And so what an odd thing that RCV, I think, is going to do, we don't have enough history really to know, is that it's going to flip around things about how you win elections. Currently, the major parties don't want to have a third-party challenger from their side. Great if it's on the other side, not on my side, okay? Great if it's over there. It's going to flip around, I believe. Now I believe we're going to see a proliferation, if I can get that word out, of third-party or fringe candidates, because it's a get-out-the-vote strategy. Before, we don't want a third-party challenger, but now it's like, well, you got a Green candidate, you got a this candidate, a that candidate. If they're on the fringes, great, have them there, because they will get people to the polls who might not vote otherwise. And then the key thing is to say, okay, now here's what you're going to do for the second choice.
Yeah.
So I believe what we're going to see happen, and maybe this is what the Democrats see, that there's a first mover advantage by pushing this, that they're going to know what to do to win RCV elections. Eventually the Republicans will wake up and figure it out. But I think what we're going to see is the special interest groups trying to push candidates that will get people to the polls.
So over specific issues, maybe?
Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Emily's List, those kind of groups
Sure.
Are likely to might try to get candidates on the ballots, again, as a get-out-the-vote movement. So when I said before that we could wind up with ballots with 6, 7, 8 candidates,
Yeah.
we could. In fact, in the ballot you talked about, the Florida 2000 in Orange County, there were 11 presidential candidates on that ballot. That's why they had to go to the butterfly ballot, because there were so many candidates. Rather than have them on sequential pages, they had them on one with the quote butterfly.
And people were thinking that
They voted allegedly wrong.
Yeah.
But 11 candidates. So imagine trying to format a page with 11 columns.
I really want to impart to our viewers that we're not talking theoretical. This is going to appear as a question on the November ballot. And we will, as voters, have the opportunity to go yay or nay for or against ranked choice voting. And it is already implemented, not just in Maine, but I was doing some research. It is in some small areas in Massachusetts right now. I think Cambridge and Northampton, and then somewhere down towards the South Shore, but also New York City, I was surprised, has ranked choice, at least at maybe municipal elections.
I know San Francisco did.
Oh, see, so when, I can't help but think when we were talking in our previous episode about the things that can magically happen in large cities where there may or may not be a lot of oversight. There's not, things can get lost in the sheer numbers and volume. Maybe this is also potentially one area.
Vermont had it. They call it instant runoff voting, IRV. Right. Same thing. They had it, and then they voted it out.
Did they?
Yeah.
But now you mentioned Bernie Sanders in Burlington, Vermont, has a funny relationship with ranked choice voting.
Well, this is kind of an interesting one. I laughed at this because he supports RCV. And in fact, he's co-sponsor of legislation at the federal level to implement RCV in the Electoral College in our presidential elections, so that the winner of the state, determining who gets the electoral votes is who gets the most votes. Right now it's a plurality by state, but they want to change it to being a majority, and if somebody doesn't get the majority in the first round, then you'd go to the ranked choice voting method to determine who would get the electoral votes. So Bernie's in favor of it there, but you heard him in Iowa, where in the first round, the initial voting, he got 6,000 more votes than Mayor Pete, and he said, from where I come, if I get 6,000 more votes than the next guy, I've won the election. Yeah. He said something almost directly like that, and he's also on the debate stage tried to get a pledge from the other candidates that whoever goes into the Democratic convention in Milwaukee with the most delegates should get the nomination. So he's in favor of plurality wins when it works in his favor. Mm-hmm. But he says he's in favor of RCV. So Bernie, which is it?
Yeah.
I think what we see is that Bernie is a politician.
Yes, and probably a very good one.
I mean, hearing all this, I just see this as being just a way to confuse older voters, as well as, basically it's a do-over by the Democrats. We're getting too close. The numbers are too close when it comes to some of these national elections. We need a new way to do things. Mm-hmm. And that it just seems like we have a potential for losing, so we want to change the rules.
Well,
and if you understand the rules, especially the first time through, you have a natural advantage. And that's what I think scares me, is that I think, okay, are all the voters going to know the rules? And clearly they're not. How long will it take for people to figure them out?
I can't even answer that. I'm almost like tongue-tied trying to think, because working the polls, I know how easy people can get confused. It's something you don't do every day. It's something you do, a couple of times a year at the most, and then all of a sudden you see names, you see all these people on TV, you get confused. People are still coming up to us to vote and say, I don't know who to vote for.
And that is the way things are now. You change it to this, it's going to be pandemonium at the polls.
And a very interesting thing again from the state of Maine, where I went and researched this thing. The state of Maine has a PowerPoint slide deck, about 12 slides, that explain how ballots are supposed to be interpreted when they're mismarked. What do you do if somebody
Divining.
if somebody chooses the same person for first and second place? Well, I've seen people saying if somebody does that, the ballot's disqualified, and that to me is voter suppression.
Right.
Because if it's not going to change an RCV calculation at all, because it's not going to change the voting.
Right, if I voted
But to
for him
say
once, that's counted.
and having them as second place isn't going to give them an extra vote the way the RCV is calculated.
correct.
But now you say you're going to throw it out if they do first and second the same, and you know a lot of people are going to do that, especially if there's no other candidate on your side of the political aisle. So that to me is an example of, I don't know if it's voter suppression, but voter manipulation. But then you look at other things like if somebody chooses a first place vote and a third place but not a second place, we're going to assume that third place is a second place.
Right.
So it's the dimple chads
Yes,
and the hanging
yes,
chads all
yes,
over again.
it is.
And the other thing, and this is in the ballot initiative we're looking at, it's almost identical to what they're doing in Maine. Where's the calculation for the second round done? At the precinct level? No. A data file was created with basically the first, second, third choice votes for everybody who voted, and that data file is sent to a central office in Maine and Augusta. The way that the ballot initiative reads here, we'll go to the Secretary of State's office, where a computer is now going to figure out who won. Well, how do you audit this? And you got 3 days for a candidate to ask for a recount. 3 days. Well, you wouldn't ask for the recount unless you can see how the calculations were done. So this is really opaque. So, you know, there are positive things to say about RCV. You know, a majority wins. I think we're all in favor of that. But it's not simple and easy. People who voted for the worst candidate, arguably, are getting a second bite
Get
of the
a
apple,
do-over.
as
They're
you
doing,
like to
yeah,
say.
a second bite at the apple.
But the real negative thing to me is the opaqueness, the lack of transparency in how this occurs, how the voting is tabulated. That's the part that I think all of us, anybody who believes in legitimate elections, should be concerned there.
Why don't they seem to want it in presidential elections?
Constitutional issues.
Okay. It would go to the Supreme Court, perhaps.
There's an argument about one person, one vote, which gets to the idea of somebody getting to vote twice. They technically don't get to vote twice, but they sort of do. It's a real gray thing. I mean, I can make an argument on both sides of that.
Yeah, I mean,
Could that be then determined to be unconstitutional?
That's what I think is the question: is if they did it at the national level, would it then be deemed unconstitutional if somebody won as a result of it, and you wind up with a Supreme Court challenge? And goodness knows you don't want that having to happen between November 6th and January 20th, you know, with the Supreme Court
right.
be able to make
we lived with that back in
Yes.
2000 or
Yes.
Yeah.
and that was very difficult.
That was
And
very difficult.
I think our time's up already. I mean, we just zipped through this, and I wish I could say.
We had a lot more questions for you.
I know.
Sort of covered them though.
We're just trying to wrap our heads around this.
It's a
This is
very complicated
ridiculous.
system.
Yeah.
There's
Yep.
no doubt about it.
And the weird thing is, there's no reason to have a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh choice
No,
voting.
at some
Because
point.
all the decisions are made on the first and second choice, but they want us to complicate the ballot, asking for third, fourth, and fifth for no reason at all.
Thank you, Dr. Fred.
Thank you.
This has been wonderful but confusing.
Well, I've got articles on my website.
Oh, then
do you
give
wanna-
your website, please.
My website is greatbrook.com, like a big flowing stream of water.com. That's my own website, and if you go to the little search window, type in ranked choice, and you'll find my articles.
Thank you for joining us tonight and
been
trying
great.
to shed some light on this. And we thank you for watching Your Right to Know and sitting in tonight with the FRCC. Remember that your local City or Town Republican Committee is the only grassroots organization that supports and holds dear your constitutional rights, your liberty, and your conservative values. We encourage you to join us. Why? Because to us, the GOP stands for growth, opportunity, and prosperity for all people, and because we always stand for freedom. And I'd like to add on one other thing about our Workers' Credit Union for underwriting the show and giving us the opportunity in this nice studio. Again, thank you, Workers' Credit Union. You support our First Amendment rights for freedom of speech. Thank you and good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So us all unite to yearn and strive for our republic that reflects our values, that preserves our rights, and goes forward in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights, and goes forward in power and might.